We're on the razor's edge. Professor from the University of London says this new Cold War must end before the world faces Armageddon. The background to the conflict in Ukraine and the Kremlin and NATO versions that complement each other. After a year of war, Russia is still engaged in the second invasion after Georgia on the internationally recognized territory of its neighbor, which turned out to be much bloodier and more destructive than the first one due to the incomparably stronger resistance of Ukraine. The international dimension of the war has been dramatically highlighted by President Joe Biden's recent visit to the country of Ukraine, where there is no U.S. troop presence. NATO countries are increasing their support for Ukraine, despite speculation about how tired they are. And Beijing has just presented a peace plan, which is previously consulted with Moscow, since it is supposed to bind them a friendship without borders. In his recent speech, Vladimir Putin offered no prospect of peace with Ukraine, instead blaming the West for the conflict. He said the West, started the war, and we used to continue to use force to stop them. Gilbert Achcar, professor of development studies and international relations at the University of London, wrote an analysis published in The Conversation with the aim of understanding how the world arrived at this dangerous juncture, and to judge as fairly as possible, we must first consider the historical perspective. He says, there are basically two conflicting accounts of the chain of events that led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. The Kremlin version, one perspective, the pro-Russian version, presents this invasion as Moscow's response to the 3 decades of U.S.-led Western incursion into its former sphere of sovereignty as part of the U.S. push for global hegemony. The two major rounds of NATO enlargement towards the east were perceived by Russia as hostile and provocative gestures, all the more so since Russia itself was never invited to join the alliance, whose raison d'etre was precisely to deal with it after the Second World War. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were admitted as NATO members in 1999 as part of the first U.S.-led war since the end of the Cold War, for which the UN Security Council was bypassed. 6 other former Russian-dominated states joined NATO in 2004, along with the 7th from the former Yugoslavia. Among them were 3 former Soviet republics, the 3 Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The backdrop this time was the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq that had begun the previous year, once again bypassing the UN Security Council and recommending yet another Washington-led violation of international law. The previous year, George W. Bush unilaterally scrapped the anti-ballistic missile treaty, much to Moscow's chagrin. So when at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 he insisted on promising Georgia and Ukraine to join, Vladimir Putin felt compelled to act before Russia found itself sharing a long North Atlantic border with a hostile alliance. The events in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 were a consequence of this. Putin ended up ordering the invasion of Ukraine in a failed attempt to bring about regime change in that country, just as the U.S. had tried to and failed in Iraq. And the NATO version? The opposite perspective, the NATO version, presents the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a product of Putin's delusions of grandeur and his ambition to reestablish the imperial rule of Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. Since becoming Russia's president at the turn of the century, Putin has gradually increased the concentration of power in his hands and become increasingly authoritarian. This process accelerated after his return to the presidency in 2012, after the interim period in which he was officially replaced in his position by Dmitry Medvedev, although he continued to pull the strings from the position of prime minister. Facing mass opposition upon his return, Putin felt threatened by the prospect of a Western-backed color revolution against his government. He invaded and annexed Crimea to bolster his legitimacy, knowing how popular such an annexation would be in Russia. His success in this venture and the relative limitation of Western backlash, along with the effect of his prolonged self-isolation for fear of contracting COVID, led him to envision a further step to support Russian nationalization by submitting to take Ukraine. He has tried to do this by invading it and so far has failed miserably, as the country's resilience has exceeded all expectations. Keep cool or else. Which of these two accounts is correct? The objective answer to this question is both. Both are true, and there's no contradiction between them. In fact, they completely complement each other. This is because Washington's post-Cold War behavior provided the perfect conditions for the development of the Russian revenge that Putin has managed to embody, writes Professor Akhkar. Where does the recognition of the above two sets of facts about the current war leave us, though? There's no doubt that the main responsibility for the present tragedy lies with Russia. Its invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked and openly premeditated. Assuming that Putin was convinced that the majority of Ukrainians would become his special operation, he should have cancelled it and withdrawn his troops as soon as it became clear that he was wrong. Instead, he has bogged down his country's military in a long, murderous, and destructive war in East Ukraine. Russia must withdraw its troops from where they are before February 24, 2022. As for Crimea and the parts of Donbass controlled by Russian-backed anti-Kiev forces since 2014, their status must be resolved by peaceful and democratic means in accordance with the UN Charter, along with the deployment of UN troops in the disputed territories. The world cannot afford another world war to restore international legitimacy. The new Cold War, launched by Washington less than a decade after the first one, ended and now embedded in Russia's murderous invasion of Ukraine and the dangerous saber-rattling around Taiwan, must end before it reaches Armageddon. And this is from Pentapostagma. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box